It's not that I hate people. I just prefer the quiet of my own mind. The thoughts that come when there's nothing buzzing in your ears, nothing trying to sell you something, nothing demanding a response. Just space. Space to exist uninterrupted. That's why I hike alone. There's a rhythm to solo hiking that soothes something deep in me. Every step a metronome, every breath crisp and cold like it's been scrubbed clean by the trees. I don't need anyone to keep pace with me. I don't have to talk, to laugh at something unfunny, to make eye contact when I'm not in the mood. Out there, in the thick of wilderness, I don't have to be anything at all. So when I was given 3 unexpected days off, thanks to some internal company restructuring that temporarily paused our entire project, I didn't think twice. I packed my gear within the hour. By nightfall, I was already planning a new route through a stretch of forest I never explored before. A dense patch of highland wilderness several hours from the nearest town, and even further from any cell tower. That was the point. I reached the trailhead early the next morning. The air was cool, a whisper of autumn already edging into the leaves. My car was the only one in the gravel lot. I parked, tightened the straps of my pack, and stepped into the woods. From the very beginning, it felt like slipping into another world. The trees formed a high green canopy that filtered the light into soft shadows, dappling the ground in warm gold. The earth smelled of moss and old pine. Everything was alive, but not in the way cities are alive, loud and demanding. This life was subtle, beneath the surface, a kind of breathing you could only hear if you stopped and listened long enough. I listened. Hours passed like minutes. The trail was narrow in some places, almost swallowed by underbrush, and I had to keep my eyes sharp to stay on track. But the difficulty was part of the appeal. I didn't come out here for a leisurely stroll. I came to feel small, insignificant in the face of towering spruce and knotted oaks. To lose myself just a little. There was no phone signal, as expected. By the 3rd hour, I stopped checking. No chirps, no vibrations, just the occasional rustle of wind and the steady crunch of my boots on leaves. Even the bird song seemed to space itself out, drifting like smoke in the high branches. By late afternoon, I found a decent clearing near a winding creek. The water moved fast enough to mask other sounds, something I found oddly comforting. I pitched my small one-person tent beside a fallen log, boiled some freeze-dried food, and watched the sun paint streaks of orange through the trees. I hadn't seen another soul all day. No hikers, no prints on the trail, no trash even, just untouched forest in every direction. For a moment, I was truly happy. It wasn't until night fell that the stillness began to press in. At first, it was a relief, the kind of deep silence that only exists far from civilization. But then the quiet started to stretch too long between natural sounds. The creek still gurgled beside me, but where were the frogs? The crickets? That soft hum of life that usually comes alive after dark? I sat by the tent for a while, wrapped in a thermal jacket, watching the last of the daylight bleed away. The trees stood like dark sentinels. Still, heavy, watching if trees can watch. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something about the silence felt different. Weighted, like the hush in a room where someone's just whispered a secret. Not hostile, just expectant. The fire I'd built hissed quietly. It gave off enough light to paint a small perimeter in warm orange, but beyond that, the woods swallowed everything. The kind of black that doesn't blink. And when I finally climbed into the tent, zipped myself into the sleeping bag, and closed my eyes, the stillness came with me. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept telling myself it was just the excitement of the hike, the newness of the trail, my body getting used to the firm ground again. But deep down, something else was gnawing at me. Hours passed, maybe longer. I don't know what time it was when I heard it. A quick shuffle, just outside the tent. The sound of movement, low to the ground, cutting fast through dry leaves. I tensed, breath catching in my throat. It wasn't large, at least not heavy. A raccoon, maybe, or a fox. Something foraging, curious about the smell of my dinner scraps. I stayed perfectly still, ears straining, heart thudding quietly against the fabric of my sleeping bag. But the sound didn't repeat. No footsteps, no growls, just a single, sharp scurry, and then back to silence. I convinced myself it was nothing. A rodent. A breeze catching loose branches. The forest always had sounds. Half the time they meant nothing. I told myself this over and over until my thoughts blurred and the rhythmic babble of the creek pulled me closer to sleep. But even when my eyes closed, my mind stayed alert, waiting, listening, because somehow it still felt like I wasn't alone. And in a place this deep, this far from anyone or anything, that wasn't a comforting thought. Morning came heavy, the kind of tire that clings even after a full night's rest, though rest had been anything but full. The scurry outside the tent hadn't returned, and nothing had stirred after that, but the silence had teeth. It bit through the thin fabric of sleep and left me raw. Still, I unzipped the tent, boots crunching on frostbitten leaves, and forced myself into the morning ritual. Coffee, stretching, pack adjustments. The air felt different, thicker, cooler than it should have been. I blamed elevation, or maybe nerves. I told myself it was nothing. The plan was to push deeper. I had mapped a long loop trail that ran through denser forest and curved around to connect with a secondary route 2 days out. It wasn't marked on official maps, just a faint outline on an old hiker's forum, a path that hadn't been maintained in years. That was the appeal. Untouched places. But by noon, the trail had thinned more than I expected. The dirt path bled into scattered roots and uneven terrain. I found myself doubling back more than once, something I rarely did. I usually had an internal compass, a feel for direction. But the forest here didn't play fair. Landmarks seemed to repeat. Fallen logs I could have sworn I'd passed already. A jagged split tree that kept appearing from different angles. The compass on my pack told me I was still heading east, but even that felt suspect. Light barely pierced the canopy anymore. A dull green glow filtered down, diffused and strange, like the world was submerged underwater. That's when I saw the boot prints. At first, they didn't register. I was adjusting my footing on a slope slick with mud when I noticed the impression, deep, recent. Not mine. The tread was different. Larger, wider spacing. A heavier step. I crouched beside them, ran a finger through the edge. Still moist. No debris collected in the print's grooves. Someone had passed this way not long ago. And yet, all day, I'd heard nothing. No disten voices. No snapping branches. No smell of fire or sound of gear clinking through the brush. Nothing but trees and the hush that draped itself over everything like a wet cloth. I kept going, eyes scanning, listening harder. There was a long stretch of silence where even my own breathing felt intrusive. My thoughts started to warp, recycling themselves into questions. Who else would be out here? Another solo hiker? A hunter? A local? But none of it made sense. I hadn't seen any vehicles at the trailhead. No tents. No signs of life. Just those prints. They followed the same path I was on. They weren't erratic. No rush in the steps. Whoever it was, they moved with purpose. Comfortably. I wasn't sure why that unnerved me more. By late afternoon, the trail all but vanished. I had to rely on instinct, following the shape of the land, cutting through brush where the compass nudged me. The forest began to slope downward. Pine needles gave way to patches of slick rock and soggy moss. At some point, the boot prints disappeared, or maybe I just stopped noticing them. As dusk rolled in, the light dimmed faster than it should have. I set up camp near a split boulder at the edge of a hollow, the forest rising steeply behind me. The sound of water trickled faintly from somewhere below, maybe another creek or a runoff stream. It felt like a safe place to stop. But the moment I stopped moving, that feeling returned. The watching. It settled over me like a second skin. Every time I turned my head, I expected to catch someone vanishing behind a tree. Shadows seemed too deliberate in their shape, too intentional in their movement. Nothing overt, just a weight. An invisible presence just behind the curtain. I lit a small fire. Not for warmth. For comfort. The woods didn't feel empty anymore. They felt observed. Like every step I'd taken that day had been mirrored by something just beyond sight. Night fell heavy. A slow, suffocating darkness that swallowed the sky without ceremony. No stars. No moon. Just black. The fire flickered in erratic patterns. No wind. but the flames leaned as if reacting to something I couldn't see. I tried to eat, but the food stuck in my throat. I chewed without hunger. Every sound the forest made had been replaced with a singular, aching silence. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of nocturnal life. Just that same hush, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Sleep came grudgingly, but not for long. At some point, hours later, or maybe only minutes, I opened my eyes to darkness. The fire had died to embers, casting a dull red hue through the thin mesh of the tent. I blinked, disoriented, unsure what had roused me. Then I saw them, two small orbs in the bush, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. Reflected light, like eyes catching a beam, but they weren't the right shape. Not round like a deer's, and not the right distance apart. They were too wide, too high, not animal, and they weren't moving. I lay perfectly still, muscles locked, breath shallow. My heart pounded in my ears. I blinked, slowly, deliberately. The eyes didn't change, didn't flicker, didn't shift. Just there, watching. 1,000 thoughts fought to make sense of what I was seeing. Could it be an illusion? Light on dew. 2 spots of water catching firelight, just right. But I knew better. I'd seen that kind of reflection before, on highways, in night hikes, in animals caught in flashlight beams. This wasn't that. This wasn't natural. The worst part wasn't that the eyes were watching me. It was that they weren't doing anything else. No movement, no sound, just a still, silent stare, as if whatever was behind them didn't need to move, as if it had all the time in the world. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every so often, I'd blink, look away, look back. They were still there, fixed, like part of the landscape. No rise and fall of breath, no soft blink, no hint of retreat. Eventually, the fire died completely. The last glow of red faded to black, but the eyes, they stayed. Even in total darkness, I could feel them, burned into the space just outside the tent, like heat without flame, like intent without form. The hours dragged like years. I lost track of time. I stopped checking my watch. I stopped moving. I just listened and waited and prayed for dawn. And when light finally began to creep through the canopy, thin and weak as paper, the eyes were gone. No broken branches. No footprints in the frost-covered grass. No indication that anything had ever been there. But I knew better. Something had watched me all night, and it hadn't blinked. The morning after the eyes, I broke camp in record time. My hands trembled with every knot, every clasp. I wasn't thinking clearly, just moving, pack strapped, boots tight, eyes scanning the tree line even as my breath fogged in the cool air. I needed to put distance between me and that place, but more than that, I needed something to anchor me. A landmark, a trail marker, anything that told me I was still tethered to the world I knew. The trail, if it ever existed in the traditional sense, had long since vanished beneath a carpet of ferns and wet leaves. Even the compass felt unreliable, as if the needle had grown nervous, shivering slightly in its glass dome no matter how I held it. It pointed east or something close to it, but the landscape defied orientation. Hills rose and fell where they shouldn't. The trees grew too closely together, twisted and gnarled, limbs hooked like reaching arms. I knew I was off course. That much was obvious. But no matter how many times I stopped to recalibrate, every direction felt the same, wrong. I didn't realize how far I'd wandered until the brush thickened into a wall of thorns and brambles. I pushed through instinctively, the green lashing my arms, branches clawing at my jacket. My boots caught on roots, and I stumbled forward into a clearing that should not have been there. That's when I saw it, the house. It sat hunched at the base of a hill, half swallowed by earth and ivy, as if the forest had been trying to reclaim it for decades, but had grown tired midway. Its roof sagged under the weight of rot, shingles peeled like scabs. Windows were shattered or gone entirely, gaping sockets rimmed in green. The door hung limp on rusted hinges, barely connected to the warped frame. A tree had grown sideways in a part of the wall, roots splitting the siding, like nature had decided to swallow it whole and then changed its mind. The structure exhaled silence. It wasn't just abandoned. It felt hollow, like something had been scraped clean from the inside. Yet I couldn't stop myself from approaching. My legs moved without permission, boots cracking over broken stone and mossy boards. There was no path to the house, no walkway, no sign anyone had stood here in years. And yet, the front room had no floorboards, just damp earth covered in a film of green-black mold. A crumbling armchair, slumped in the corner, half collapsed beneath a beam. Shelves tilted sideways, their contents long devoured by time. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something underneath, something like rusted metal and mildew, with a sweetness that did not belong. Near the fireplace, almost absurd in its placement, lay a book, a small, leather-bound journal, unscathed by the filth around it. No mold, no water damage, just resting there like someone had set it down hours ago and forgotten to pick it back up. My fingers hovered over it, hesitant, but curiosity won. It always does. The first page was written in looping, childish handwriting. The ink was faded but legible. The entries were dated from the early 90s, maybe earlier. A boy's thoughts. Simple, harmless. He wrote about hiking with his dad, how they would go exploring, find caves and old trees, try to catch frogs near streams. He mentioned how quiet the woods were. Peaceful, safe, but the tone shifted slowly at first. The next set of entries mentioned the dad not coming back from a solo trip, how he'd left one morning and never returned. The boy stayed in the cabin waiting, writing, hoping, but no one came. Then the fear set in. He began to write about voices at night, whispers outside the window, scratches at the door. He thought it was his dad at first. Then he wasn't so sure. The voices didn't use his name anymore. They used words he didn't understand. Sometimes he said they laughed. Later entries were less coherent. The boy talked about being taken, not by someone, but by something. He described a place underground, wet and cold, a place with no walls, where screams echoed and didn't stop, where you couldn't tell if you were standing or sinking. He started writing about a man with red eyes, or maybe not a man at all, something that looked like one but too tall, joints bent wrong. It watched him through the slats in the walls, waited until he slept to come closer. One eye it spoke, but the boy said the voice came from inside his own thoughts, not his ears. That's where the writing began to change. The last few entries were different, almost etched into the page. The handwriting shifted, sharper, angled, more frantic, as if someone were carving each word in a hurry. And the ink wasn't ink anymore. It was red. The words stuttered, looped back on themselves. Sentences unfinished. Pages smeared. I couldn't tell if it was madness or fear or something worse. One page stood out, written in large, uneven scrawl across the bottom of a near-blank page. The letters scratched through the paper. He still walks here. He watches the ones who come alone. He waits to be found, so he can be seen again. That was the last entry. I closed the book slowly, my hands cold despite the damp warmth of the house. The silence pressed in again, heavier now. A silence that seemed to be listening. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch cracked. Not fallen. Stepped on. I shoved the journal into my pack without thinking. I didn't want to take it, but I couldn't leave it behind. That would be worse. The front door creaked as I slipped back outside. The trees looked taller than they had before. The light was dimmer, and I realized, with sudden clarity, that I had no idea which direction I'd come from. The forest didn't look the same anymore. As if something had changed while I was inside. As if something had moved. The weight of the journal hadn't left my pack, but it felt heavier with every step. As if carrying it tethered me to something. Not an object, not a memory, something else. Something that wanted to be remembered. I didn't run at first. I walked brisk and focused, determined to retrace my steps and get out. But within minutes, it became obvious I was moving in circles. Not just figuratively. Literally. I passed the same leaning tree 3 times. Its bark was split down the center like a torn seam, black mold veining out from the wound. Each time I saw it, I felt something deeper unravel. My pulse throbbed in my neck. Panic threatened to boil over. The sun was lowering behind the treetops, though I couldn't see it directly. Just a dimming, like someone was slowly lowering a heavy curtain. The shadows weren't long. They were wide, stretching in unnatural directions, crawling up tree trunks instead of falling across the ground. Eventually I ran. Direction didn't matter. North, south, up or down, just away. From the house, from the clearing, from whatever was wrong in that part of the forest. But the woods didn't give way. The further I went, the more the world warped around me. Trees leaned in like conspirators. Roots buckled the earth into strange ridges. The ground softened, even where it should have been dry. I slipped, fell, pushed forward with torn palms and gasping breath. Everywhere I turned, it felt like the forest had changed. Familiar paths no longer led where they should. Glimpses of the same broken stump or crooked boulder reappeared from impossible angles. I once found myself looking at my own footprints in the mud, but they were fresh, pointed toward me. It was dusk when the sound started. Faint at first, like water moving through stone. It wasn't the creek. I hadn't heard that since I left the house. This sound didn't come from one direction. It filtered through the trees like mist, low, constant, almost mechanical. A whisper, but without breath behind it. Not language exactly, but something close. Shapes of words. Syllables trying to form, but failing. Like someone speaking through cracked glass. I stopped moving. The whisper followed. I turned. It stopped. But when I moved again, there it was just behind me. Never gaining. Never falling away. It didn't feel like being followed by a person. It felt like being followed by a memory. Darkness came before I could find another clearing. I hadn't even thought of my tent. It was long behind me, probably swallowed up by the shifting trail. When the light was gone entirely, I found a stone overhang nestled into the side of a hill, a shallow dip beneath a curtain of tangled roots and moss. It wasn't shelter, not really, but it was the best I could find. I crawled beneath it, knees raw and skin damp from sweat and rain and something else I didn't want to name. I didn't unpack. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, curled in my jacket, head to my chest, listening to the whispering thread its way through the trees. At some point, my body betrayed me. Eyes closed. Time passed. Maybe minutes. Maybe longer. When I opened them again, the whisper had stopped. At first, I thought that was good, until I realized why I had woken up. There was something near me. Not the weight of presence. Not the abstract dread of being watched. Something was there. Close enough that I could feel the heat, or the absence of it, on my skin. I didn't move. I listened. No breathing. But something shifted on the ground, just beyond the edge of the overhang. A subtle crunch. A drag. I turned my head slowly, pulse hammering. In the dark, I could just make out a figure crouched beside the roots. Pale skin gleamed faintly where moonlight, what little filtered through the trees, caught its limbs. It looked like a child, but wrong. Too long in some places, too short in others. Limbs bent the wrong way. Head too still, body too tense. As if it were waiting for something. As if it had been frozen mid-motion. My hand found the flashlight. Slowly, quietly. Every nerve in my body screamed not to turn it on. But I had to see. When the beam clicked on, the figure twisted. Not like a person turning. Like a puppet, yanked suddenly by tangled strings. It scampered away. Not crawling, not running. Its limbs flailed in unnatural arcs, spine bending sharply one way, then another, as it disappeared behind the tangle of underbrush. There was no sound of leaves rustling, no thump of feet hitting the ground, just movement. Gone. The flashlight trembled in my hand. I kept the beam steady where the thing had vanished, breath held, ears straining. Nothing. And then below the overhang, just inches from where I'd slept, I saw them. Symbols, carved into the dirt, not scratches from an animal or patterns made by wind. Deliberate shapes, angles that echoed the symbols from the journal. Lines crossed in patterns that made no logical sense but drew the eye all the same. Some were deep, gouged like they'd been scratched with something sharp. Others were faint, traced over again and again as if to keep them alive. I stared at them too long. My head throbbed. My mouth went dry. The whispers returned, but inside. Not from the woods. From somewhere under my skull. Like they'd been waiting. I backed away from the carvings, hands still gripping the flashlight, sweeping it across the forest's edge. Nothing moved, but the sense of presence didn't leave. It was with me now, not behind me. Inside, watching through me. I didn't sleep again. I just sat there, knees to chest, until morning came like a pale bruise through the trees. When I stood, I found new prints in the mud beside mine. Barefoot, small, and pointed in both directions. Dawn broke like a secret that couldn't be held back any longer. Gray and brittle, seeping through the trees as if the forest regretted letting it in. The light was no comfort. It cast everything in shades of ash, turning branches into claws and roots into twisted limbs. I was already standing when it came, the ground beneath me marked by symbols I hadn't made and footprints I hadn't left. I didn't pack, didn't eat. I left the tent behind. The journal too. Every ounce of instinct screamed to run. Not walk, not navigate. Just go. So I did. Direction meant nothing. My compass had long since become a spinning needle. The sun, what little of it could be seen, shifted behind the clouds in erratic patterns, refusing to serve as any real guide. But I didn't stop. I crashed through underbrush, scrambled over roots, tore through thorns. My legs bled and my breath shredded my lungs. I didn't care. Every tree looked the same, and yet none of them did. Some leaned at impossible angles. Some bent toward me, leaves trembling though the air was dead still. At times I thought I could hear footsteps behind me, mimicking mine just a half beat behind, but every time I stopped, the silence returned. Thick, aware. At one point, I heard sobbing. Soft, human, just behind a thick elm to my left. It froze me. For one brief moment, I wanted to believe it was someone else, another hiker, maybe someone else trapped in this place. Someone real. I stepped toward it, cautiously, heart hammering. There was no one behind the tree. Only me. A reflection, rippling across bark like water on glass. My own face, twisted in grief, I hadn't let myself feel, eyes brimming with tears I hadn't shed. The figure mimicked nothing else, just stared back, weeping. When I blinked, it was gone. That nearly broke me. But I kept running. The forest changed again. Subtly, then quickly. The trees grew farther apart. The ground began to slope downward. Somewhere in the distance, water ran. Not the haunting whispers of before, but the real, chaotic chatter of a stream. The sound anchored me. Then finally a path. Faint, overgrown, but unmistakably man-made. The remnants of a signpost jutted out of the soil, half buried in moss. The letters were long worn away, but its shape was familiar. Trail marker. I stumbled onto the dirt trail and collapsed. My legs wouldn't carry me any further. My vision blurred. I remember the light shifting above me, leaves fluttering. Then nothing. I woke hours later to footsteps, real ones. Boots on dirt. A voice muffled calling out. Then hands. A stranger's face. A blur of movement and water and reassurances I barely registered. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my lips cracked. All I could do was hold on to the feeling of solid ground beneath me and the reality of someone else's presence that didn't flicker or bend the laws of logic. Back home, everything was wrong. The apartment was too bright, too still. Every corner seemed to stretch just a little too far. Every sound came a second later than it should have. I told myself it was exhaustion, stress, trauma. But at night, the forest came back. Not in dreams. Not always. Sometimes in reflections. In the faint sound of breathing behind doors I hadn't opened. Sometimes in the curve of a shadow too tall to belong to anything human. I tried to tell myself I was safe. That the thing, whatever it was, belonged to the woods. That I had left it behind. But I knew better. I looked up the area late one night after I'd calmed down enough to be curious. I searched trail maps, park records, anything. There was no listing for the cabin. No history of a house ever existing in that stretch of forest. I widened the search, dug deeper. What I found instead were reports. Missing hikers, all solo, spanning years. Some old, from decades ago. Others recent. Names, vague dates. All vanished without a trace. No bodies, no gear, just gone. The search efforts had always been quiet, contained, small scale. Park rangers interviewed. Nothing ever found. I recognized one of the names. A boy. His age matched the journal. The year did too. I don't hike alone anymore. Sometimes I don't go outside at all. The curtains stay closed. The door stays locked. I work remotely now. Friends think I'm dealing with something, anxiety, burnout. I let them believe that. But the truth is, I'm still being watched. Some nights, I catch glimpses in the edge of my window. Not a person, not a figure, just those eyes. Far apart, too high, reflecting light that isn't there. They vanish when I blink, but they always return. Once, I saw them in my car's rearview mirror. Just for a second. I haven't driven since. A week ago, I woke to find something on my kitchen floor. A single sheet of paper, torn from a journal I'd left behind in the woods. The handwriting was different, erratic, deep, written in red. Just one line. He waits to be found, so he can be seen again. I burned it, but I still dream of the house, of the thing that watches. And I know, no matter how far I run, it remembers me. Because I saw it. And now, it sees me too.